Okay, so I'm live here with 52 weeks of AWS, and I'm going to continue talking about AWS security. And the topic for today is incident response, which is a pretty fun topic, actually. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So you can see here that I'm going to talk about responding to and managing a security incident. So let's go ahead and kind of skip through until I get to some fun stuff here. So in terms of the shared responsibility model, that's really where we're going to start diving into the details here. Again, always your responsibility to look at what AWS does and what you're going to do, and figure out, really where you are going to have to jump in. And so, once we get into that concept, we can talk about identifying an incident, and then how do you respond to it, and then manage that particular incident. So, if we think about this particular section here, one of the first things to start out with is that not everything is going to be an incident. So you need to look at the set of information, the security policies to identify, contain, and then eliminate a cyber attack. And the goal of incident response is to enable an organization to quickly detect and halt an attack, not have too many false positives, but also minimize the damage and prevent future attacks of the same type. So first up, how do we do this? Well, how would you know if an abuse was taking place? There's sometimes really similar abnormal events that look like they're abuse. So how would you actually know? Well, one of the ways to think about this would be to look at logging in from a remote location. An employee could be traveling or using a VPN, a hard drive that is really operational still. This could be an issue where the enterprise is doing cycling of the drives, and you'd want to go through and make sure that you can get in there before it's too late. Also, an employee could be trying to access a resource they shouldn't access. So in this particular situation, maybe it's not a breach, but it is a behavioral issue that you could dive into, let's say from AWS CloudWatch, and you can say, oh, we have some problems. We need to figure out what's going on. So this is part of the discovery phase. So uh, in the first part of that discovery phase and recognition phase, this is where you would want to do incident identification, logging, categorization of the incident, and then you would want to use user reports, solution analysis, and then manual identification. And this incident is then going to be logged as an investigation, and then you can go ahead and get started. So during this phase, let's say you would get a notification, and those notifications are set up by the user, and they're initiated by specific alerts to send an email, a text message, or maybe even something through a mobile app. And at that point, you would need to, let's say, notify a more specialized employee, hey, there's something going on here. We need to actually take a look at it. If you look at the investigation and diagnostics associated with this, you would also need to figure out strategies to resolve any threats. And AWS offers a range of services and products that help companies discover and identify events that could lead to or already become an incident. So, really, that's phase one. Now, in phase two, what we want to think about is when an enterprise does know that there's a component of failure, or there's a reduction in quality of service, or there's an exploit, for example, that's on servers, they would then move into the resolution and recovery phase. And this would be forensic isolation. So you want to isolate that incident and then do a deep dive to figure out what the root cause is. You'd also want to stage a fix. So reproduce the issue, apply a fix, and test. And this is really critical. Like if you cannot reproduce the issue in a test environment, then you're essentially doing magical thinking, right? You're potentially not solving the real problem, which in many cases is worse because you could be applying some other solution and then hoping that it actually fixed it. So it's really important to be able to reproduce it. Also, then deploy the fix. So once you've tested it out, push it into the new infrastructure, and then at the very end, you would go through and resolve the incident. So if we think about the key takeaways here in identifying an incident, it's that there's a set of information that you can use to identify, contain, and eliminate cyber attacks. Not all of the events are incidents that need immediate remedy, but the first phase of an incident is the discovery and recognition phase, and the second phase is resolution and recovery phase. So let's think about the AWS services here that support discovery and recognition. If we look at some of these things here, we have Trusted Advisor, CloudWatch, Inspector, GuardDuty, AWS Shield. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about these particular services. If we think about Trusted Advisor, this is a kind of default tool that is always in your account, and you can look at the dashboard and see what's going on. But basically, it can show you that there's security checks that are not being passed, which is a hint, right, that you need to actually go in there and dig into it. If you have business support, for example, or enterprise support, you can also use the console or the support APIs or the CLI to even go in and dive into it a little bit more. And you can even hook up Amazon Event Bridge to monitor the status as well, which is pretty nice because you could have, let's say, automatic triggers with SNS that could send a text message, hey, we have a problem. You need to go ahead and investigate that problem. Now, CloudWatch is the kind of the default tool here that you would use for flexible monitoring, and you can do this immediately. Really, you don't need to set up anything. It's already available for you. And then inside of the CloudWatch system, you would automatically display metrics about AWS services. You can create an alarm, you can do metrics, notifications, etc. So it's really the one-stop shop for monitoring and instrumentation. We also have the Inspector, which is a vulnerability management service that would continuously scan an AWS workload for vulnerabilities. So this is a great idea, right? Like, why wouldn't you want to scan your system for vulnerabilities constantly? And then it can even go into the EC2 instances and even container images that reside in the Amazon Elastic Container Registry and look for certain vulnerabilities or maybe an accidental network exposure that you don't need. So this is a very good idea for essentially defensive techniques. We also have GuardDuty. And so GuardDuty is a way of continuously doing monitoring, and you can identify unexpected and potentially unauthorized or malicious activity in your AWS account. And this service would use threat intelligence feeds. For example, it could look at traditional malicious IP addresses or domains, and it could use machine learning to identify certain kinds of patterns. And it can also detect a compromised EC2 instance that is serving out malware or mining Bitcoin, the service that keeps on giving here, in terms of crime. And the service also is going to monitor AWS accounts for weird things that they're doing. So this is also a very good idea to have essentially an offensive technique here where you're like proactively looking for weird behaviors. We also have AWS Shield, which provides the ability to protect an enterprise network against a DDoS attack. And so this is what a DDoS attack is essentially a way of disrupting your normal traffic by overwhelming it with traffic that is unnecessary. That's really it in a nutshell. It prevents against that. We also have AWS Config, and this is a way of looking at an inventory of all the different resources and change management. So I think this is actually also critical. This concept has been around for a long time. The concept of basically snapshotting changes and making sure that those changes are the ones you want. And the reason why this is so important is that somebody could have accidentally manually made a change that introduced a security hole. We also have the ability to evaluate rules. So in the case of AWS config, if there was a configuration change, let's say someone opened up a bucket and made it public, which has been the source of breaches in the past, AWS config would automatically evaluate the change. And then you could actually have automatic remediation as well, which is even better, right? If you're able to know that certain buckets should never have public, exposure, and even somebody that accidentally did it with an administrative account, if you can remediate those changes, that actually is a great system and a great way to essentially have an offensive mode of attack, so that you're preventing these things from happening. So really, in a nutshell here, the key services to be aware of would be Trusted Advisor, CloudWatch, Config, Inspector, Shield, and Guard Duty. So let's talk about services that would help you with recovery phase and resolution next year. So these services would include AWS Systems Manager, AWS CloudFormation, Amazon Simple Notification Service or SNS, AWS Step Functions, and then AWS Lambda. And these are event driven in the case of the bottom here, SNS, Step Functions, and Lambda. And these are things that can be very helpful when you're thinking through how to build out a resolution. So with Systems Manager, you get visibility and control of the entire infrastructure on AWS, and Systems Manager will provide a unified user interface so you can view operational data from multiple AWS services and then automate those operational tasks across the resources. That's a high-level overview of that. Now, there's also CloudFormation, which is infrastructure as code. And CloudFormation helps you model and set up resources. And you can focus on, let's say, using a template that would describe all of the resources you want. And then CloudFormation would provision and configure those resources. And an enterprise could use CloudFormation to recreate a staging environment using an isolated or forensic VPC. And then once that system is isolated, the team could deep dive and discover the issue and even provide a way of reproducing the issue, applying a fix, etc. So infrastructure as code is a critical component of security in the cloud. Now, we also have SNS, which is a way of sending notifications that are event-driven, and they can go to applications, they can go to users, and they can go to devices. And SNS and Lambda are integrated. And when a message is published to a topic, you would then invoke the payload of that published message. So this could be things like sending topic messages or sending messages to other services. And so an enterprise could use SNS to receive notifications of, let's say, potential exploits that have been found. Now, we also have Step Functions, which is a visual workflow tool that you could use to distribute applications. You could automate certain things, and you can build data and machine learning pipelines with it. And what's really great about this is that it has nice instrumentation and logging. So you can see every single event and what happened, what were the failures, what was successful. And so this could be a great way to have security remediation by building step functions that respond to, events that you figured out are high risk events. We also have AWS Lambda. So AWS Lambda is a serverless event-driven compute service that you can use to run code on demand, and you don't have to manage servers. And Lambda functions are stateless as well, which means that you don't have to actually worry about the underlying infrastructure. And if you need to store secrets, for example, you could use the AWS Key Management Service for that. So this is a great service for automation for security. And so how would this work in terms of Lambda for incident response? Well, a Lambda could basically, detect that there's some kind of problem, and then you would remediate the event by, for example, talking to EventBridge, which listens to CloudTrail. Then CloudTrail sends some kind of message to SNS, which then, maybe a human then would dive in and say, what's going on here? We need to fix this particular incident. Now, how would this work in a real world scenario here? Let's say there's an instance that's removed from an auto scaling group and is snapshotted. Then the instance is isolated, and then a CloudFormation template is used to create a new environment, and then a basic forensic investigation is performed on the volume that's attached, right? So that would be one of the key ways to dive into what's happening in terms of incident response. Now, what are the key takeaways here? Well, the key takeaways are that if you want to use resolution services, it would be Systems Manager, CloudFormation, Lambda, SNS, Step Functions. These are the services that you want to care about. So what are the best practices next for handling incidents? Well, one of the ways that you can do this is you would want to identify the key people in your organization, and you would want to make a contact list of those people and who you would need to have involved in a particular incident. So if you don't have this, you're in trouble, because when the situation does occur, you're going to be scrambling to figure out who to talk to. The other one is preparation. So you want to be prepared by having an easy to follow run book of the different things that you would do to escalate a particular issue. So again, if you don't have this already in place, you're already in trouble, because when the event does occur, you're going to be scrambling. So, some of the things to think about here would be that, really it is important to have planning before you get too far down the weeds with an organization. So if we are going to really wrap things up here, some of the things that we talked about were, identifying an incident, describing AWS services that are used for incident recognition and remediation, and then identifying the best practices for those services. So really to kind of wrap things up here, I would say that the biggest thing with the security response is preparation. So if you don't have a plan of what you're going to do, and you don't have ways to test how to fix when there's problems, you're going to get yourself in a situation that could be, maybe an existential threat for your organization. So, planning, preparation, and making sure that you are able to prototype a solution and even identify the resources that are compromised are some of the key components of this incident response. All right. Well, that's it for this week. I will talk to you soon.